sponsored by NordVPN. How do we get from this to this? This month, Windows turns 40, and although Microsoft didn't invent the idea of a graphical user interface, to billions of people, using a computer means interacting with this UI, a taskbar, a start menu, and a bunch of floating windows. In this video, we're going to be digging into the story of how the Windows UI grew up, from the earliest days of Windows that weren't even legally allowed to overlap, into the classic grey and teal 90s aesthetic, the Frutiger Aero look of XP and Vista, the historic blunders of the Metro era, through to the modern look of Windows 11. So it's time to look back over the past 4 decades of design and see just how far we've come. I'm Alex Dobie, this is XDA, let's get into it. Windows 1.0 landed on November 20th, 1985, a year and a half later than originally planned. It was supposed to be Microsoft's answer to the user-friendly Apple Macintosh, which debuted in '84. The original Mac was considered a revolutionary moment in computing, even though in reality Apple lifted a lot of the key software concepts from work done in the late 70s by Xerox. Seriously, this photocopier company is one of the unhailed pioneers of software design.
This is an experimental office system. It's in use now at the Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto, California.
So in essence, what you had was Apple copying Xerox, and then Microsoft taking heavy inspiration from the product that they built out of that. You've probably already seen the screenshots, the goofy Steve Ballmer parody ad, and know that Windows 1.0 essentially looks like it was designed by programmers, which it definitely was.
It's Windows from Microsoft! Order today! P.O. Box 286 DOS, except in Nebraska!
It was a very basic blocky graphical shell that ran on top of MS-DOS, and it's kind of tough to even call it an operating system in its own right given how little you could do with Windows 1.0. Unlike Windows 95 and later versions, if you wanted to tinker with certain settings, you'd need to wade into the spooky command line world of MS-DOS. Although Microsoft had an agreement with Apple to be able to use some of the GUI elements popularized by the Macintosh, that didn't include overlapping app windows. So in Windows 1.0, your programs would instead be snapped into a split-screen grid, which just wasn't as intuitive. With the display resolution maxing out at 640 by 350, a 16-color palette, there really wasn't much design to speak of. Certainly compared to what Apple was cooking with, Windows 1 looked bare and utilitarian. That's in addition to being 18 months late and shipping with what were, by mid-80s standards, pretty eye-watering system requirements. 40 years later, of course, you can emulate a pretty nippy Windows 1 experience through your web browser, go figure. One thing I've come to realize in researching retro tech is just how insecure everything was back in the day. But don't kid yourself into thinking that you're automatically protected just because you don't live in 240p land. Security and privacy threats are more common and more dangerous than ever before, and that's where this video's sponsor comes in. NordVPN is the best VPN service for online security, and now you can get up to 77% off a 2-year plan plus 3 months for free. Nord is one of the fastest VPNs in the world, with speeds of up to 6,700 megabits per second. It adds an extra layer of protection to your daily internet use by encrypting your traffic, shielding your online activity from hackers and snoopers, especially useful if you travel a lot or use public Wi-Fi. And you can appear as if you're virtually anywhere in the world, with servers in over 126 locations. NordVPN also comes with an integrated anti-malware tool and continuous dark web monitoring, so you'll know about any leaked credentials before the bad guys do. A single plan covers 10 devices and all major platforms are supported, so head to nordvpn.com/xda to get up to 77% off a 2-year plan plus 3 months for free. Thanks to Nord for sponsoring, now back to the video. With Windows 2.0 later in the 80s, Windows became more powerful, including adding support for overlapping windows, which itself led to a lawsuit between Microsoft and Apple. Window borders got this chunkier look to better distinguish one app from the other, while still having a very 80s utilitarian feel to it. But it'd take until the next version, shipping in 1990, for Windows to feel like more than just a glorified file browser, thanks to, among other things, the introduction of the Program Manager. Windows 3 added new app icons courtesy of artist Susan Kerr, who had previously designed icons and fonts for the original Macintosh. That went along with color customization, letting you change the hues of your window frames, and that gave rise to the infamous hot dog stand color theme in Windows 3.1, designed to show off Windows' color rendering capabilities with eye-searing primary colors. But there still wasn't much of a story to be told around Windows' design. It remained pretty Spartan on account of the potato-level graphical power of the tech of this time. That said, looking at Windows 3 in particular, you can see the visual polish that makes this feel much more like an actual consumer product and less like a tech demo. Version 3.1 is missing a lot of the stuff we associate with modern Windows, but the buttons, drop-downs and labels of the Windows of the early 90s are surprisingly familiar here. Even though it looked primitive, the early years of Windows laid down the foundations for Microsoft's long game, a graphical shell that could eventually stand on its own. Windows 95 was a huge milestone for Microsoft, setting the stage for its market dominance going into the 2000s. For the first time, Windows 95 feels like it's not totally constrained by the hardware, with support for higher resolutions and richer color palettes. And although technically it still ran on top of MS-DOS, you never needed to go back to the command line if you didn't want to. Windows at last was its own proper big boy OS. Windows 95 also brought more visual flourishes, with the new 3D UI featuring more pixel art depth effects, part of a directive from Microsoft that the fourth version of Windows should be fun, interesting and sexy. And of course the introduction of the taskbar and start menu, which played a central role in Microsoft's marketing. Windows 95 brought all your running apps into one central location at the bottom of the screen, with the desktop serving as a canvas for further shortcuts. Meanwhile, the Start menu gave you a cascading layout for your apps, documents, settings, and more. It was the brainchild of designer and psychologist Daniel Oran. He's got a post on his Harvard blog about how it came to be that's definitely worth a look if you want to learn a bit more. The taskbar of Windows 11 today may look different, but the key ingredients, the Start menu, apps, system tray, can all be traced back to that pivotal version of the OS that first shipped in August 1995. Microsoft actually played around with a few different ways of implementing the Start menu, including splitting everything between 3 distinct buttons and various animations for minimizing and maximizing apps that can be seen in beta versions of Windows 95. Windows 98, ME and 2000 made further tweaks to the formula, adding a sexy 16-bit gradient option for your window title bars, alongside more detailed app icons that started to drift in a more skeuomorphic direction, versus the very abstract Windows 3.1 icons. Windows also became more web-focused, with Windows Explorer bringing web browser-style navigation that made it easier to go backwards, forwards, and copy and paste. And thanks to Active Desktop, your entire desktop background could even become a web page if for some reason that sounds like a thing you'd want to do. So that was the standard Windows look of the 1990s. Grey paneling, blue and teal backgrounds, not exactly a visual feast, but much easier on the eyes than the bare bones and sometimes even monochrome Windows UI of the 1980s. For the first time, Windows actually had a distinct personality. But if that's still too dull for your taste, then strap in, because in 2001, Microsoft took us into a world of bubbly buttons, soft shaded translucent icons, and a whole lot more color. Windows XP didn't always look like this. During development, Windows codename Whistler, as it was back then, used this watercolor theme that's a lot more flat and a lot less vibrant than the XP that we eventually got. To me, the watercolor theme from XP betas actually has aged pretty well, arguably better than the default theme in Windows XP proper. I don't know, let me know which one you prefer down in the comments. Nevertheless, if you went anywhere near a PC in the 2000s, you'll remember this familiar blue and green UI. The greys of the Windows 9X generation had been banished, or at least consigned to an optional classic theme in the settings, and in its place was something lighter, brighter, and much more modern feeling for the early aughts. Microsoft worked with Icon Factory to create over 100 new icons for XP, and enlisted Frog Design to handle other aspects of the branding, including the taskbar, start menu, and media player UI. Microsoft may have released a Windows Millennium Edition the previous year, but when XP arrived in 2001, it really looked like this was Windows for the new millennium. Your typical PC could now display higher resolution visuals with 16-bit or 32-bit color depth, which opened the way for more detailed UI elements with bolder colors. Windows XP's new theming engine was made possible by technology licensed from Stardock Corp, whose Window Blinds app was a popular theming tool for Windows back in the 90s. Where previously Stardock's tech let you turn Windows 98 into a low-budget video game UI, now it was at the heart of the way Windows looked. Although still very much a 2D UI, the elements of shading and depth effects gave a flair to Windows that had previously been missing. As a result, XP felt like an entirely new version of the OS, as the Start menu, Explorer and Control panel all got their own 2000s era glow-up. More pixels on screen meant more space to display relevant shortcuts and visual flourishes. Although some derided it for its Fisher-Price-like appearance, there were other colour palettes available that didn't have quite as much of a Babby's first computer feel. You can broadly say XP is part of the same design era as Apple's Mac OS X, with its famously lickable icons and glass-textured panels.
And we call that new user interface Aqua, because it's liquid. One of the design goals was when you saw it, you wanted to lick it.
There's a big change in the Start menu. You will notice that all the icons and the visual effects are really much richer color. We've gone away from the 3D gray look into a much more graphical look.
A lot of people who grew up in the 2000s look back on XP with nostalgia. It represented a bright, serene digital world and a simpler time, and is associated with the early internet age of Web 1.0. The location of the default Bliss desktop wallpaper from Windows XP is even signposted at the place of its original capture in Northern California, so iconic was the XP look. Windows XP is one of the key starting points of the Frutiger Aero aesthetic that dominated software and web design in the 2000s. It's a term that's retrospectively been used in recent years to describe the design trends of this era. Glossy, glowy buttons and textures, heavy skeuomorphism where controls look like physical objects, and optimistic sky blues and grassy greens. The Frutiger name comes from a popular typeface at the time, and the Aero part is lifted from the design language of XP's controversial successor. That's right, we need to talk about Windows Vista. The development of Windows Vista, aka Windows Longhorn, was famously fraught. We've got a whole video on that I'd highly recommend if you want to dig deeper. Long story short though, Microsoft bit off way more than it could chew and had to reset the project entirely in mid-2004, leading to lengthy delays. And the controversy didn't stop after the OS shipped. Again, we've got much more in our dedicated deep dive video there. Windows Vista, or Longhorn, or whatever you want to call it, was always supposed to be a major visual overhaul for the OS, taking advantage of the 3D hardware acceleration that was becoming common in the mid-aughts. Early concepts showcased a glitzy smorgasbord of glass panels, alongside many ambitious features like a multifunctional sidebar and relational file system, both of which were heavily scaled back in the retail release of Windows Vista. One major feature that did arrive though was the Aero Glass interface. That was the name for Vista's shiny new 3D UI. And you can really see it as taking what Microsoft started with XP and making everything more glassy, more translucent, and more 3D. The taskbar and window borders got this fancy pixel shader blur effect. You had the new 3D Rolodex dealie for switching apps, and even live wallpapers were included with the Vista Ultimate Edition. This was Microsoft fully leaning into Apple-style skeuomorphism, not just with the central glass metaphor for Vista's UI, but also in other areas like its icons, which became ever more detailed and photorealistic. The Vista UI was seen by some mid-2000s critics as bloated and a waste of resources, and that's not entirely unfair. The graphical demands of Aero Glass were fairly steep by the standards of the time, but looking back almost 2 decades on, I think the Vista look has aged pretty well. It's not quite what Microsoft was originally aiming for. Many early concepts show a lot more animated flair, but it's visually consistent and period appropriate, and if your system had the horsepower to spare, then why not use it to give Windows a bit more eye candy? Windows 7 followed in 2009 as essentially a tuned up, polished, debugged version of Vista with some key changes to the way the taskbar worked. Unlike every version since Win95, the default behavior showed just a single app icon down below with no labels, and pinning apps to the taskbar made common apps easier to jump back into. It's really the beginning of the current implementation of the Windows taskbar as we know it today. By the late 2000s, Windows design had hit a kind of glossy perfection, but that same aesthetic would soon feel bloated and old-fashioned in a world quickly turning towards touchscreens and mobile minimalism. Oh boy, where to even begin with this one? Windows 8 was an unsuccessful attempt to marry the Windows desktop OS with the touch-first interface from Windows Phone. Microsoft was obsessed around this time with not dropping the ball with its response to the iPad, just as it had fumbled its rivals to the iPod and iPhone. And so Windows 8 was an overcorrection, leaning way too heavily into the world of touchscreen devices to the detriment of what had been a proven and popular desktop experience in Windows 7. Microsoft's most egregious sin in this era was the removal of the Start button. Instead, a swipe-in gesture from the right edge would pop open this shortcut bar from which you could access the Start screen. This was a full screen layout of live tiles basically lifted straight from Windows Phone. Unlike earlier versions of Windows where the Start menu acted as the portal to everything you could do on your computer, the Start screen mainly existed to push you towards full-screen, touch-enabled, so-called modern Windows apps using the Metro design language from Windows Phone. That's fair enough on a tablet, but on a desktop PC it was unforgivably clunky. And users found the whole desktop versus Start screen dynamic, where you effectively had two competing interfaces and sometimes even two different versions of the same app existing in each world, to be confusing and frustrating. Now, I don't dislike the Metro UI, I think it was a joy to use on Windows Phone devices, but its bungled implementation on desktop Windows is almost entirely to blame for Windows 8's market failure. It's a shame because if you live mostly in the desktop world, there were some pretty neat additions to this UI, like the flatter, more modern look for Windows in the 2010s, and the ribbon-style menus inspired by Microsoft Office, and much needed refreshes of key areas like the Task Manager and copy-paste dialogues. Even so, Windows 8 as a whole comes across as a discordant Frankenstein's monster made up of two OSs that sometimes seem to be in active conflict with each other. Windows 8.1 made some improvements, including the optional resurrection of the Start button, but really it'd take another couple of years after that for Microsoft to recover from what was arguably the most unpopular version of Windows. The Windows 10 era marked a course correction and a new philosophy for how Windows should look and feel. It spanned the demise of Windows on smartphones and the beginning of the modern age of the OS, with more first-party Microsoft hardware in the Surface line of devices. The old live tiles weren't entirely gone, but they were included in a much more sensible way as part of the new Windows 10 Start menu, no more full-screen takeovers. And you'd also see them in the new Action Center, which served as a combined quick settings and notification area. Initially, Windows 10's icons were kind of a mishmash of various visual styles, some from the old Metro world, some flatter and more shaded, though with a transition towards a more angular and shaded look over time. And although Windows 10 shipped with a dark mode only, Microsoft eventually included a light theme that felt a lot less oppressive. After Windows 8 tried to turn the desktop into a tablet, Windows 10 effectively did the opposite. It pivoted much more back towards the desktop and found a single compromise UI worth keeping. Windows 10's design was never as bold or opinionated as XP or Vista, but it was stable, familiar, and quietly modern. You could still tell it was Windows, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like it was fighting with itself. As more of the Metro design influences were scraped out of Windows throughout the late 2010s, Microsoft eventually introduced the Fluent design system as the brand name for the modern Windows UI, built around light, depth, motion, and material. The idea was to blend the clean, flat look of the Metro era with just enough dimensionality to make Windows feel alive again. Then came Windows 11 in 2021, a softer, friendlier Windows built for a post-pandemic world of hybrid work and touch-based laptops. With rounded corners, centered taskbar apps, redesigned icons and typography, everything here felt more balanced. Though with the loss of those sharp geometric edges, Windows arguably lost some of its distinctiveness. Under the hood, Fluent evolved into something new, mica, a dynamic material that subtly tints the window background with your wallpaper's color. It's one of those tiny touches you don't really notice until you switch to something new. And replacing Windows 10's Cortana, there's a new AI layer on top of Windows, Copilot, an AI tool that turns language into actions. It doesn't replace the desktop necessarily, but it's starting to root around it, and there's no doubt it will be a big part of what Windows 12 eventually becomes. Windows' evolution over the past 40 years has mirrored the story of computers themselves. The chunky beige practicality of the 80s, the teal optimism of the 90s, the glossy futurism of the 2000s, the minimalist flatness of the 2010s, and now the soft adaptive calm of today, where the technology just aims to get out of your way. For a long time, it was the technology itself that constrained how PC interfaces like Windows could look and work. After 4 decades, that's basically a solved problem. The Windows of today isn't going out of its way to show you how many colors it can render or how many pixel shader effects it can blast into your eyeballs. Nor does Windows need to hold your hand and teach you how to use a computer. Unlike folks taking baby steps into the digital world with Windows 95, it's assumed that everyone today knows about the basics of Windows icons, menus, and pointers. For the first few years of its existence, Windows was effectively a second-class OS that needed to exist on top of MS-DOS. It took Windows 95 to really launch the OS as we know it today, and decades later, even through several new coats of paint, that central design paradigm remains, although the backgrounds, textures, and icons it uses may have changed almost beyond all recognition. And with that, we're going to wrap things up. Let me know in the comments which era of Windows was your favorite. I think I'm definitely partial to a bit of Windows XP and that classic Luna look. Drop a like or a sub if you enjoyed this video, and definitely check out our deep dives on Windows Vista, Windows 95, and Windows 10 for more on those individual stories. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.